going to go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome you all. I am Melanie Craig. I'm Director of Visual Arts here at Nichols Hall. And we're so pleased that you're here today with us to hear this lovely conversation between Matthew Nichols, who's our guest curator of Ted Carey Queer as Folk, and artist Anne Buckwalter. And so I'm going to quickly introduce both of them. It won't take long. Matthew is an artist. I'm sorry, you are an artist, but you're an educator, a critic, and an independent curator. And he, thankfully to Matthew, we have this lovely deep scholarship that he's done with Ted Carey, and he's done a remarkable job of presenting an exhibition that honors Ted Carey, but also provides us deep scholarship to share with the general public, but also for our collection records. And Anne Buckwalter is an artist she was based out of Durham, Maine, and she is represented by multiple galleries, including Rachel Uffner, who is here with us today, and she is located in New York City. Anne's work can be found in the ICA Miami collection, also the Pennsylvania Academy for Fine Arts collection, and among many others. And I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit more about her practice, but we're super excited about this conversation today. Did I cover everything?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfectly fine introduction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, could you do all the way off? Okay, so, hi Andrea. So 3 weeks ago I was here and I delivered a lecture on Ted Carey, and that lecture placed his life and work into an art historical context and a social context, and I'm not going to repeat that entire lecture today, of course not, but I do want to begin with some basic biography for those of you who weren't here then, and sort of introduce some themes that connect Ted Carey's work to Anne Buckwalter's work. Anne and I have decided we're going to kind of toggle back and forth a little bit, and I'm going to do some remarks about Carey, and then we have it divided into kind of like 3 sections, and then we'll bring her work and her perspective into it at those 3 different points. So Edward Fawcett Carey was born in 1932, and he was known as Ted throughout his life. And he and his 2 brothers grew up, they were raised in Chester, Pennsylvania, and that's why I provided a map, just because there are a number of locations kind of in the Philadelphia metropolitan area or the Delaware Valley that are relevant to our talk today. But you can see Chester's down on the lower right-hand corner. I starred yes, thank you, Anne. He attended the Philadelphia Museum School of Art and received a BFA in advertising design in 1955. Soon after that, he moved to New York, where he pursued a career as a graphic designer and a textile designer. But Carey didn't start painting in earnest until 1977, and he was already 45 years old at that point. And then he died only 8 years later in 1985 from AIDS. In the final months of his illness, a solo show of his entire oeuvre was being planned by Gene Schmidt, who was the director of Art Views Gallery here in East Hampton. But sadly, Carey died on August 3rd, 1985, and that was just 1 week before the opening. And then the show proceeded for its short run, but then it was, presented as a memorial exhibition. And so on the screen is a checklist from that show, and it identifies 14 paintings, and I've located 2 additional. Last time I was here, I'd only located 1, but now I've located 2 additional paintings. But I don't think that any others exist. I'm pretty sure of that. So it appears that Carey painted only 16 canvases in his lifetime. 12 of them were executed in the decade before he died, and 9 of them are on view here at Guildhall in this exhibition. So until now, Ted Carey has mainly been known for his friendship with Andy Warhol. The 2 men met in 1957, and they remained very close until about 1962, when their friendship seems to have cooled off a little bit. But that period of intimacy is represented by this painting. I wonder if I can, well, that's not too distracting at the bottom, is it? No? Okay. Sure. Okay. So this painting is by Fairfield Porter. It's called Portrait of Ted Carey and Andy Warhol. And thank you. I guess it bothered me more than anybody else. Yeah. So in 1960, Cary and Warhol commissioned this double portrait from Fairfield Porter, which now hangs in the Whitney Museum of American Art. It's frequently on view there. I've seen it there several times, and many other people have seen it. And Cary is the man on the left, seated in the chair in the yellow sweater. So this is kind of a pictorial testament to the friendship. They were constant companions at this time. One thing they did a lot of, if you go through, for example, like Warhol's journals and some other scholarship, they visited galleries and museums a lot. And Cary is actually credited with helping Warhol find his footing as a pop artist. So in the fall of 1961, on a visit to the Leo Castelli Gallery, Ted Cary saw, he was there on his own. I mean, there are some conflicting accounts of this, but the consensus seems to be that he was there on his own, and he saw an early comic book painting by Roy Lichtenstein. He told Ivan Karp, who was then the gallery director, that he had a friend, Andy Warhol, who was painting very similar canvases. So Karp and Castelli made a studio visit they visited Andy Warhol's studio, and they were impressed with what they saw, but they declined to show that work because of the overlap with Lichtenstein, who they were just beginning to represent. So weeks later, visiting a apparently depressed Andy Warhol, Cary, his boyfriend at the time, a man named John Mann, and their friend Muriel Latow, they all collectively helped brainstorm new subject matter for Andy Warhol, and that led pretty directly to the iconic soup cans of 1962. So what I just described has kind of been Ted Cary's main claim to fame and why he occupies a footnote in the Warhol literature. But in connection with this particular exhibition, the more interesting historical fact is that Cary had a lot of influence on Warhol's collection of American folk art. So that influence can be measured by this painting, which you probably saw out in the gallery. It's called The World of Andy Warhol from 1978. And it is a bisected double portrait that portrays Warhol in 1957 on the left, when he and Cary were close friends, and then again on the right in 1977, when their lives were less entwined. So on the left, you see a younger Warhol sitting under a Tiffany lamp, and that's probably certainly a reference to Serendipity Cafe in New York, which is where they met in 1957. The stuffed peacock in the painting appears in several photographs of Ted Cary and Andy Warhol posing in this solarium. And then the object, I'll get back to the painting so you can sort of confirm these things, but the object in the lower left is an example of notched wood tramp art. The portrait bust on the table was one of the first folk objects that Warhol collected. And just to give you a sense of when this is a photo by Duane Michaels that dates to 1958. So you can kind of see all those things arranged on the left-hand side of the painting. And then on the right, you have the older Warhol seated in front of one of his skull paintings, which was a series he didn't begin until 1976. He's also surrounded by recent additions to his folk art collection, or his Americana collection is probably the better word, including this 19th century cast iron stove that is surmounted by a George Washington as statesman figure, a polychrome, which we only see in black and white obviously, but a polychrome ship figurehead of a blonde woman that also dates to the 19th century. There's also an 18th century portrait bust of Leonardo da Vinci that he had collected, which is carved out of pine and then covered with like a white gesso. And so all of these much larger sculptures on the right may represent or testify to the considerable size of Warhol's collection by 1977, because in that year, he actually presented his entire collection of folk art at the Museum of American Folk Art in New York. So when he was interviewed about his friendship with Warhol in the late 1950s, Ted Cary said, "I was very much interested in Americana. I think Andy got triggered a little bit by me because I had a lot of Americana. We went to the country a lot, we went to antique shops, and Andy started to collect." And then when interviewed by that same journalist and asked about his passion for collecting folk art, Andy Warhol said, he said, I guess Ted got me interested. I mean, Ted, Ted was living in Sugartown or something like that. That was in Pennsylvania. And so again, bringing us back to that map, Sugartown is the dot sort of to the, on the top and to the right. So it's very close to his home. No, sorry, not that one, but it's not terribly important, but it's close to Ted Carey's hometown. This is Sugartown, and this is Westchester. So I haven't actually been able to confirm that, as Warhol suggested, that Ted Carey lived there, but it is a historic district close to his family's home, and it is preserved. It has long been preserved as like a quaint 19th century crossroads. So Richard von Hess was another close friend of Ted Carey, and they both studied graphic design at the Philadelphia Museum School of Art. After his graduation, von Hess moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on the right side of the map. And he eventually became an art director for the Armstrong Corporation, which manufactured linoleum and other sort of home decor products. And von Hess was also a lifelong connoisseur of the region's visual culture. In the mid-70s, he and his wife purchased and restored this place, which is called Wright's Ferry Mansion. And it's in Columbia, Pennsylvania, which is very close to Lancaster. And they restored it and they furnished it with period, 18th century period furniture and ceramics and textiles. But von Hess also amassed a significant personal collection that reflected his interest in colonial American silver and Pennsylvania Chippendale furniture and pottery associated with the region. So this painting is not in the exhibition. It is a painting by Ted Carey. It's a portrait of Richard von Hess. It's not the best reproduction. You kind of have to ignore the lampshade in the bottom left because this actually came from a Sotheby's catalog, and it was kind of an in situ picture of the painting. But it's kind of the best reproduction I can find at the moment. But as you can see, it shows von Hess in his home in Smoketown, Pennsylvania, that's located about 5 miles from Lancaster. And you can see he's seated in a chair, and it's this sort of federal-style easy chair with a dachshund on his lap. And then surrounded, of course, by all the furnishings from his personal collection. So after his death in 1997, Sotheby's did auction off the property of the von Hess estate. And if you look through that catalog, the entries confirm the very precise accuracy of Carey's painting. So for example, von Hess in the painting is flanked by 2 Chippendale walnut tea tables. There's a Windsor-style armchair across the room. When I go back to the painting, you'll see it on the left-hand side. There are a number of painted stoneware vessels that are being used in the painting to hold flowers, painted with that sort of cobalt floral motif. And then there's also a poplar corner cupboard. You can see it on the right side of the catalog that displays some of the plates and Staffordshire figurines or animal figurines that von Hess collected. So you see it there, and you can kind of see it there. And then you can see a lot of those specific objects in the painting behind von Hess in the corner cupboard, but also displayed elsewhere in the room. So Carey may have been a frequent guest at von Hess's home, I'm not sure. But clearly, from this evidence, you can see that he had the opportunity to closely observe and depict these specific objects. I just wanted to show you one other reproduction of this painting that I'm not, that doesn't have the lampshade in it. But again, I haven't seen this in person yet, and I've only seen it through these 2 pictures. So I want to sort of pause here and introduce Anne, bring Anne into the conversation, because she was born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And Anne received her BFA from the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia in 2008, and then she went on to an MFA at the Maine College of Art in 2012. But I want her to, she's very willing to do this, but to speak about her background and her Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. And we'll look at her paintings associated with that.
Yeah, before I launch into talking about myself at all, I also and before I forget, I want to say thank you to Guildhall for having us today and all of you for being here. And when Matthew emailed me several months ago about Ted Carey's work and about this show, I had never heard of Ted Carey and, was completely moved and floored by this work and the amount of intense research and really thoughtful detective work that Matthew's done about this very obscure figure is just like very inspiring, and we're all benefiting from it. So especially with such a limited body of work, it's really incredible to see these paintings. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And yeah, so I did grow up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was born and raised there, and I have Pennsylvania Dutch ancestry on both sides of my family. So both my mom's side and my dad's side have been in Pennsylvania for centuries, and originally came by way of the Alsace region of Germany through Switzerland. They were in the, I think, late 1700s, early 1800s, were fleeing religious persecution and landed in Pennsylvania, like a lot of Pennsylvania German settlers there. And I grew up, with my family is not Mennonite or Amish, but I'm about 2 generations removed from Mennonites, so on my dad's side of the family. So I grew up with my grandparents speaking some Pennsylvania German, and felt very steeped in that heritage growing up. And that really involved a lot of looking at, things like painted furniture around the house, really decorative art, works of Frachter, which is a traditional Pennsylvania Dutch illuminated manuscript style, which you can see. This is one of my paintings, and you might recognize a sort of Pennsylvania Dutch motif there in the painting at the top. There's a lot of use of birds and flowers and sort of whimsical details, hearts. And as we'll talk about this later, a lot of works of Frachter are quite feminine and decorative and have a sort of inherent gayness to them, I would say. I grew up in a family that, my dad and my grandfather were both decoy carvers. So I come from sort of a lineage of people working in those sorts of domestic craft traditions. And when I was at Tyler for my undergraduate degree, I spent a lot of time going to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where I really fell in love with folk artists like Horace Pippin, who is also from Pennsylvania, Grandma Moses, who is, I believe, from upstate New York, but sort of also in the canon of great American folk artists. I felt really drawn to that work. And the Philadelphia Museum also has a really wonderful collection of Pennsylvania Dutch folk art, so furniture, Frachter, paintings, textiles, quilts, that sort of thing. And I think it was really important for me to see these objects that I really correlated with a sense of home kind of exalted in this institutional space. It sort of validated to me that like those sorts of expressions were really as meaningful as like great masterworks of art, and that was really meaningful to me. So, yeah.
So, in my introduction with Ted Carey, I was trying to underscore in that first section sort of the iconography of the fact that in those 2 portraits, the one of Andy Warhol and his collection of Americana, and then the second one of Richard von Hess, that in those 2 paintings we see Carey, duplicating these specific objects. And in Anne's work, I was noticing that in these she's a very prolific artist, in my opinion, and so we're just looking at a selection here today, but would you mind talking a little bit more about like some of the specific motifs? Like you did say that you're on your father's side that there are decoy carvers, right? And what about the sort of the rug on at the bottom of this painting?
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch textiles and quilts, and I'm not a quilter myself, but I'm really interested in that kind of work and the sort of way that quilts sort of function as abstract paintings, and so I like to include them in my own paintings. So you'll see a lot of very common quilt patterning show up. Like this is, I think, the Lone Star, the Star of Bethlehem. There's a lot of stars in quilts. And as well as the sort of like tulip shape there on the chest, which is a common motif in Fraktur. And, you know, Fraktur is also, it's interesting because it started out as a specifically like a text-based form, I believe, was primarily used for like birth and baptismal certificates and house blessings and wedding announcements and that sort of thing. Things that were really connected to the home and to family life. And then the term Fraktur has sort of expanded to involve a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch folk art that may or may not include text and might just be drawings or completely decorative work. So and not so much the text-based Fraktur, but I include a lot of the more like pictorial Fraktur in my work. And then also things like, I mean, actually remarkably a lot like Ted Carey's work, some of the painted dishware, like the Corel patterns and the Falstaff patterns that I grew up with.
Yeah, here's one that you said you grew up with some of these objects, right?
Yeah, so I don't know if anyone recognizes this particular Falstaff pattern, but this was in my parents' china cabinet when I was growing up, and this, you know, it was so exciting to see the Tiffany lamps in Ted Carey's paintings because I was like, I do that too. This is the lamp that's hanging in my childhood home over the kitchen table. So there's a sort of a mix of including objects that feel very personally significant to me and are directly taken from my own autobiography, and then including some things like these are, you know, I'll just sort of include motifs in like a playful way in other places.
And then I have one more for this section, which I think is called the Star of Bethlehem. No, I'm sorry, this one's called Good Listener.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can say something about the wallpaper as well. Like I grew up in the 90s in rural Pennsylvania and was in a lot of homes that had like very, very floral, a lot of beige wallpaper, very floral patterns and that kind of thing. So that's sort of the reference to that. And then, there's another quilt, another Lone Star quilt with the sort of alphabet motif, which is like a common thing you see in quilt making. And then, of course, there's some like erotic elements, but we're getting to that.
So this is a little like artificially structured, right? But in these first paintings, I just wanted Anne to sort of talk about that sort of Pennsylvania, that very personal and Pennsylvania German iconography that shows up in many, many of her works. But the next thing that I wanted to discuss is sort of like the formal composition of her paintings and those of Ted Carey as well, and how they do in many respects derive from conventions of folk art painting. And so to do that, I do want to say that this is one of the paintings by Ted Carey that I just recently discovered, like in the past weeks. So it's a bad picture, it's a bad photograph, it's a dirty painting, as you can see, and there's a pretty substantial crack running down the right-hand side. But it is clearly an homage to Edward Hicks and his Peaceable Kingdom. And Hicks was a Quaker minister and self-taught painter who lived in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, which was the star like at the, above north of Philadelphia on that map, which I won't go back to. But Hicks created at least 60 of these paintings during his lifetime, maybe closer to 100. But he sort of worked and reworked this composition in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And like Hicks, and so here's one example on the left. This one is from 1834. It's a really nice version that belongs to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. But if you look at them side by side, you can see that Carey is also showing a harmonious menagerie of animals, and that is meant to represent the biblical prophecy in the book Isaiah, which says, the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. Carrie kind of dispenses with the little child, but he also oddly sets the scene in winter, right, when snow is falling. And Anne and I were talking about this because it seems like he is locating it on a Christmas tree farm, because I can't understand why any other reason why there would be all these very tiny evergreens growing in that landscape. And it could be a reference to southeastern Pennsylvania, where Christmas tree farms are actually quite prevalent. But Carey's snowy version of the Peaceable Kingdom also relates to one of the paintings in the exhibition. You might have noticed the Museum of Modern Art Sculpture Garden is also shown in winter, blanketed with snow. And together, they demonstrate the formal features that I kind of want to talk about with Anne today and with you, features that Carey seems to extract not only from Hicks, but from American vernacular painting more generally. And that would be, often there's a tilted ground plane that creates a very, a two-dimensionality or a pictorial flatness. There's almost always very diffuse and even lighting that never casts any shadows. Oftentimes, or always really, the figures are stylized. In this case, we're looking at statues and animals, but in both cases, they are very stylized. They're not necessarily anatomically correct. And then something that came up 3 weeks ago when I was lecturing, this idea of selective attention to detail. And because that detailing is very particular and selective, it tends to draw your attention to certain things over others. And then another possible influence on Carey that Anne already mentioned is Horace Pippin. And I think this is an interesting possible influence because he's a self-taught African-American painter who was a celebrated resident of Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is very close to Chester, Pennsylvania, where Carey was from. So, and he gained significant attention and support in the 1940s, especially from the Philadelphia art community, from Philadelphia art patrons and institutions. So this one I picked out, it's called The Den. It's from 1945, and it actually depicts a room in the colonial home of Jane Hamilton, who was one of his wealthy patrons who had a house on the main line of Philadelphia. And you can see, of course, the ceramic figurines lined up on top of the mantle, which made me think very, of the von Hess portrait that I showed you in terms of presenting a collection of objects. But then also I was thinking, here's a Horace Pippin painting called Choir Practice, which, and I'm not insinuating that Carey looked at these paintings or copied these paintings in any direct way. Nonetheless, the sort of formal features are very similar. The way that the space of the gay bar on the right is similarly constructed to the presumably this room in a church where the choir practice is taking place. So with that, I did want to go back to Anne's work, because she mentioned her enthusiasm for Horace Pippin, and this is a Horace Pippin painting on the left called Victorian Interior from 1945, which is sometimes on display at the Met. It belongs to the Met collection, and this is one of Anne's paintings from 2023 called Woman in Three Stages. But can we maybe talk about some of the formal issues that that you work with when painting?
Yeah, I mean, I like to work, as you mentioned, the sort of distorted perspective and kind of tipping up of planes, so you can sort of see this is not the correct atmospheric perspective of how a table looks, right? But seeing the entire surface allows you to see the objects on it more clearly. And that is a trope that's sort of directly inspired by Americana and folk art. Similar to this Horace Pippin painting, something I think about a lot is the use of symmetry, or almost near perfect symmetry. And that's something that I see a lot of in works of Frachter, where there are kind of decorative elements placed in bilateral symmetry that are almost the same but not quite the same. And I I don't know if this is why that is the case, but I can't help thinking about the sort of moral and religious background of how those works were created. I mean, there's a lot of there's kind of a well-known stereotype of Amish quilts that there's always a part of the quilt that is left purposefully imperfect, like a square that's left a different color or undone or a different shape or something. And the idea for that is because it incorporates some humility into it. So it's like, you know, you don't want to pretend that you're as perfect as God, so you throw in like a discolored square in the quilt. So that's just something that I guess has been on my mind when I've made works that are. I'm not going for exact symmetry, either top to bottom or side to side, but I like the sort of awkwardness of having things be near symmetrical, and that's something that I feel like I see a lot of in folk art as well, and particularly in this painting.
Here's another of your paintings, Measure Twice, from 2024. In terms of the two-dimensionality, the sort of assertive flatness, it seems that you were talking about wallpaper before, but your interest in patterns helps to reinforce that aspect of the paintings.
Yeah, and that's another thing that another cue I've taken from folk art. There's a lot of kind of juxtapositioning, intense patterning areas of pattern next to each other, and I see this in Ted Carey's paintings as well. There's almost a sort of shorthand that he develops for the way that he treats specific materials. So like he paints snow. In those paintings you showed us, like the mark making that he uses for snow is very similar from painting to painting, and he kind of uses that as like a personal vocabulary for how to create that material. And that's something I feel like I do a little bit with like wood, for example. Mm-hmm. It's like kind of always treated the same or drawn the same way.
The tabletop and the floor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in other paintings too.
This one, you mentioned this morning that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, well, when Matthew showed me the images of Carey's work, I was really attracted to the borders on some of the more portrait focused paintings, and I think about using borders a lot with my work. Maybe not always as actual decorative borders, but I think a lot about how to draw attention to the edges of the canvas and sort of reinforce the painting as an object, which I think is, it's an interesting kind of a thing that comes into folk art that is kind of a not quite geometric abstraction, but also not something that is in realistic painting either. It's sort of an in-between. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that, like, I was really drawn to those borders, and I often think about how to emphasize the edges of the painting by putting things close to them or actually creating a decorative border.
This one, Fastnacht Day, Anne was explaining that this is the particular delicacy that's being prepared on the counter is specific to Pennsylvania German cuisine, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's a very beige cuisine. There's a lot of dough, and Fastnachts are traditional Amish potato donuts that are made and fried on Mardi Gras every year. And a lot of cultures have like a Mardi Gras equivalent type treat like that, but this is the Pennsylvania Dutch one. So I grew up having Fastnacht Day in school and that kind of thing. So.
But again, I wanted to, and the other thing I should sort of state as sort of a very broad caveat is by asking Anne to be in conversation with me today, in no way am I suggesting that she and Ted Carey have led these like directly parallel like creative lives, not at all. But there are some interesting overlaps, and I think the overlaps come from their sort of shared interest in this broader sort of vernacular culture of art making. And so again, this, despite the very interesting food preparation in the foreground, I sort of picked this out as another example of that sort of assertive two-dimensionality, the tilting of the picture plane. Also the fact that, as I said before, in so many examples of American vernacular painting, there is that even in diffuse lighting that never really casts any shadows. Is that something that you became consciously aware of and started to replicate also?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too when we started talking about Ted Carey together, thinking, like you referred to him as a faux naive painter. And I think that is something that, I guess I hadn't thought about it too seriously before then, but like Ted Carey, we both had the privilege of having an academic training in art. And so a lot of folk artists, are called naive painters because they don't have academic training. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, like how much, and obviously Ted Carey isn't here to ask him, but how much of how he paints is a stylistic choice that he is thinking about in contextualization with American folk art, and how much is how he just naturally, his natural inclination towards painting. And that's also something I think about too. But
another one that I wanted to present, which again, similar sort of formal issues at play here. This is a relatively, despite sort of the size of the room that's depicted here, I find this to be like one of the more spare compositions in your work. I guess because the very, the center of the, and we'll get to this actually, this is something I do want you to talk about, is your process of art making. These are gouache paintings on prepared panels, and I was going to ask Anne to talk about that a little bit more, but this one I thought, I was surprised by the correlation compositionally between this and the Imak Bakia painting. Again, in no way is there any Anne was not looking at this. She never even knew that Carey existed until a few months ago. But the point is, I think they're both sort of influenced by and informed by a broader pictorial vocabulary. And so there's the assertive flatness, but also, I was just struck by the fact that the stairwell sort of corresponds with the path, the garden path. They both have these horizontal, these sort of horizontal bands at the base of the composition, a chair to the right, a chair to the right. It was just kind of odd to me. But also, do me a favor after this talk and go look closely at the brick patio in this painting, because it's so precisely and carefully constructed in a manner that's similar to the way that you were laying down the floorboards there. So there's that. But could you talk a little about your materials and process and how that sort of informs the appearance of your work?
Yeah.
Not just go back to maybe any of them. This one.
Sure.
What are the dimensions? How big are these?
This one is, I think, around 3 feet by 3 feet, but they're often, I'm experimenting with some bigger sizes now, but a lot of the works that we've seen today are on the smaller scale, like 24 by 24, something like that. But in terms of process, I think, something I don't work from photographs or from life, from actually looking at objects. I get a lot of my reference material either from memory or I look at a lot of books of reference material. And so I'm sort of creating these invented spaces and then kind of inserting in objects of personal significance in them. And I think that is similar to what it seems like Ted Carey is doing with his space, like how he treats space as well. It's like very psychologically motivated rather than, an interest in portraying some kind of real space.
Right. So for example, the Imak Bakia I've learned is that home, which I discussed a few weeks ago, in the upper left-hand corner, is a Harry Bates modernist house that Ted Carey, owned and lived in that still exists. But this configuration of the garden does not correspond with the reality of that property. So that, relates to kind of what you're talking about, this sort of distortion and invention of the spaces to comply with the demands of the picture plane, I guess, and and in this case the canvas, in this case your panels.
Yeah, and also the decision to sort of put specific, like that pumpkin, for example, or like, he includes these kind of personally significant objects into his work in the same way that I do that. And I mean, I would be very curious. You were mentioning that you couldn't find or didn't know of any sketches or preliminary drawings for his paintings, and that's I don't make drawings before starting a painting. Like I'll at the most make like a little thumbnail sketch about how I want sort of the composition to be laid out. But for me, part of the sort of joy in the mystery of painting is like what happens as you're developing it. And so I think that it also helps allude to or like contribute to the sort of like almost awkward or kind of unfinished look to it. And I think, yeah, I was interested in the fact that there were no drawings to be found.
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't found any at all.
Yeah, I think
I've found, I said, a few reference photographs for a couple of the paintings of like the MoMA Sculpture Garden and some mannequin heads for another painting that is on view out there, but no sketches at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's wild to think that maybe even our process was very similar.
And then in terms of gouache, I was just thinking that the fact that it's a medium that has an inherent matteness to it, right? There's not, I mean, that's a difference. That's a significant difference because there's so much sort of gloss and oil present in Carrie's surfaces, and yours have more of a flatness, like a matteness that contributes, I think, to the flatness of them, would you say?
Yeah, and the way that Carrie handles paint is much more sculptural than how I prefer it to be really flat. And there's something about, for me, having different textures and different patterns manifested in this flat material, like next to each other, that is visually exciting. But yeah.
Like the illusion of different texture.
Exactly.
Right, but it's physically very continuous.
Yeah, it's very, there's an equilibrium to the textural quality for sure.
So to shift from these formal concerns to conceptual issues, I wanted to discuss something that Anne has mentioned already, but kind of the connotation. Oh, you know what? I forgot I threw this in here. I also just wanted to point out for the audience that some of Anne's work, a lot of it are interior views, but there is a body of your work, maybe a smaller portion of it that gives us sort of exterior views of gardens and yards and the facades of buildings. And I thought this was another one that made like a very favorable or sort of compelling comparison with the Imak Bakia.
Yeah, I mean, I do sometimes do paintings of exteriors because sometimes you just want to go outside. But even with that, I think I like the focus to be very much on the interior space and what's happening like within the home.
Right.
I think something, and we can maybe talk about this in the next conversation, but another departure is that I think Carrie's work often focuses more on like community and public life, and I usually am sort of more interested in like private and personal life.
Yes, that's very true.
But there are, so it's interesting to see where there are overlaps and departures.
Although I think this particular painting is the most, it's the greatest glimpse into his private life of all the ones that are out there and all the ones that I've seen.
Right, because this is him and his partner and his
his mother. Yeah,
and his
so that's Ted Carey on the left. And forgive me for those of you who weren't here 3 weeks. I like significantly unpacked like all these paintings, and I was. Yeah, I'm hesitating to do that again today in the interest of time, but that is Ted Carey in the center in the white Izod shirt, his partner, Tito Spiga, longtime partner, seated beside him on the right, and then Ruth Carey, his mother, who was recently widowed at the time of this painting, would visit East Hampton from her home in Philadelphia like a couple times each year. So this is obviously a late summer, early autumn gardenscape. As I said before, this is the home that they had. The address is right there, 20 Oyster Pond Lane. And it's just I was thinking long and hard about this painting and how kind of groundbreaking it was for the time in terms of picturing sort of the domestic bliss of a gay couple. But moving to, so I wanted to talk about connotations of American folk art, and beginning with the terminology which Anne started to mention before when you used the word faux naive, because folk art is usually referred to a general definition is art that is made by a particular community according to a shared set of like popular traditions. And other terms like primitive and naive and outsider art have been used, but they tend to imply, like a hierarchy or a lack of knowledge or a lack of knowledge or skill. But even if we acknowledge that skill, the skills of a folk artist are still usually opposed to the academic training of what we consider to be fine artists. So there are these other binaries that seem to pertain to American folk art. For example, much of it was made in the 19th century. Like much of the collectible historical folk art was made in the 19th century. But regardless of its date, it is often viewed as kind of pre-modern, nostalgic, and somewhat timeless. And then it also has strong associations with rural America rather than the city or urban centers. And then another connotation is that the subjects and messages of a lot of folk art tend to convey or often convey like innocence or wholesomeness or sometimes even like a moral rectitude, even religious fervor, as Anne was mentioning previously. So I just wanted to sort of think about that in terms of popular culture because very often in popular culture, especially if we're talking about the Amish in particular, encounters with that community are usually framed by those contrasts. So for example, this is Plain and Fancy, which was a 1955 Broadway musical that revolves around this very cosmopolitan like New York couple that visit an Amish village and they help with a barn raising and they become romantically involved with some of the local country folk. But it's like a fish out of water story. And it was very popular when it was staged in the 50s and supposedly stimulated a lot of tourism to that part of Pennsylvania. And then like fast forward 30 years and you have Witness, right, which many of you might have seen, but this is a 1985 movie, and the plot is kind of driven by those same contrasts of rural versus urban and corrupt versus innocent. And so that was, not basically, but like a big part of why I was drawn to Ted Carey's art, because he's using this typically nostalgic and wholesome and kind of provincial visual language of American folk art, but he's using it to depict scenes that tend to be urban and contemporary and sometimes kind of edgy. And in general, if you saw the show, he's depicting New York in the 1970s and 80s and the queer culture that kind of flourished there. So that kind of specificity, like adding that specificity to the language of folk art is, again, why I'm very interested in his work. And you see that in this painting, which is a tribute to Fernando Asensio, who was an icon of gay New York in the 70s, and he represents here a motorcycle club, the leather community, and the pleasures of BDSM. And then you can also say it's in this detailed rendering of Boot Hill, a gay bar on the Upper West Side, which is filled, which I won't go into right now, but I'm happy to discuss them afterwards, with a lot of interesting references to sort of like gay male cruising and mating rituals from the period. And then you even kind of can say it's in this painting, which is called Paul's Bridal Accessories. And this is a long-lived window, retail window in the garment district of New York that was both kind of campy but seriously meaningful, I think, for a queer audience of the time. So this, there are so many elements in Anne's work that provide a similar specificity, right? That sort of, maybe the pictorial language and the formal elements come out of this broader tradition of folk art, but there are always these elements that I think pull it into the present. And sometimes it's technology, which is why I sort of plucked this one out. Sometimes it's consumer products like that jar of Jif peanut butter on the left of this painting, and sometimes it's both. And this is an interesting painting with, considering our very particular, post-Dobbs historical moment. This is called Hoarding Birth Control, right?
Yeah.
But I thought, with the iPhone charging at the top and the open drawer of, help me with the,
Mifepristone.
thank you. I was struggling with the pronunciation of that earlier. But this is something that shows up in a lot of your work, and I wanted to talk about it during this last part of our conversation. The contemporary elements, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but they tend to insinuate people or bodies that are sort of absent from the pictures. But many of your paintings do contain figures. And I'm sure as I've gone through this talk today, you've started to notice them sort of glimpsed in various of the paintings you've seen already. But this is a big part of Anne's work. And those figures are sometimes engaged in various sex acts, either solo or with others. And they're always sort of expressing very different sexual desires and appetites. Some of them are kind of frankly visible in this one and in this one. In other cases, you just kind of glimpse the figures in the margins or on the periphery. Sometimes they're cropped by windows or reflected in mirrors. Here's another exterior view. And I guess I just wanted you to talk about these decisions you're making, about how you're choosing to incorporate the human figure in the works, and why sometimes those are, like I said, kind of more marginal presences in the paintings.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested in the, I guess you would say, marginal presence of a lot of erotic elements in the work, just as a way of sort of incorporating it into the everyday vernacular. A lot of folk art is very much about everyday life, and so I think putting objects that allude to queerness or allude to sex sort of weave those things into the everyday and kind of de-escalate the sort of provocativeness of them, or normalize them, I guess, for a better way of saying it. But yes, I'm certainly interested in the body and thinking about how the body can be alluded to even if there isn't a body present. So that's often why I think about incorporating specific objects or pieces of furniture that kind of act as containers of the body. Like for a while, I was just pretty much exclusively painting beds as sort of a site for, both kind of contradictory elements of things like sickness, but also sexual activity. So I'm interested in sort of creating spaces where the figure is gestured to, but not always explicitly shown. And I think that sort of gives a sense that these spaces are inhabited and are lived in by people with real desires and active erotic imaginations, and that there doesn't always need to be a figure present to convey that. But I do think about them very much as self-portraits, as psychological spaces, and so, yeah.
You were just saying that in a way, I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember exactly what you said, but I do think the productive tension in your work and in Ted Carey's work is this folk art vocabulary that is, or the sort of contemporary subject matter that is conveyed through this folk art vocabulary, right? And that creates makes some very compelling paintings to look at. But do you view it as kind of like a clash or a dissonance, but it sounds to me from what you just said that you see it as somehow more harmonious.
It's interesting to think about that, because I think I actually see it as occupying both of those spaces. Like there's an inherent sort of contradictory nature to incorporating erotic elements into the folk art vernacular, because a lot of, I mean, historically, erotic art or art about human sexuality has been, at least in Western cultures, like very much pushed to the periphery of, like hasn't really been given academic or scholarly space in the same way as like high art has. Like I think erotic art is often kind of generalized as lowbrow. And so it's often fallen to artists working in the margins, like, I mean, this term isn't used so much anymore, but like outsider artists to sort of take on erotic subject matter. And so, so there is something about including it in the style that feels quite natural for it. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, like you were saying, there's an inherent wholesomeness and sort of domestic quality to that kind of visual rendering that makes it jarring to see a figure masturbating in the middle of it. So it's, I think...
But it's not in the middle. That's actually one of my questions.
Yes,
because,
right.
No, and not to, I don't mean to, sorry if that came across as overly critical, but that's kind of one of the things I'm so fascinated by, is kind of like the marginality, the peripheral sort of status of some of those components of the painting. Mm-hmm. And if that can be interpreted, because I do see them as, they don't strike me as like really jarring and upsetting at all, mm-hmm. but their placement in the composition is what I find kind of intriguing. Mm-hmm. And if that has anything to do with like a certain, just like the potential secrecy or shame, or I don't know, just like the, that could be associated with any sort of like sexual activity.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think I am interested in that kind of, in a certain amount of the element of surprise, of being slightly taken aback or caught off guard by the inclusion of the erotic elements in them, and that's why they're often sort of like kind of hidden or nestled into the mm-hmm. works in a way that's not overtly obvious on first notice. It's more of a...
This isn't the best example, but I mean, I was trying to sort of pull a range, but like this one, which I feel like is, 90% of this painting is dedicated to the domestic tableau.
Right.
And then that one glimpse of the figure in stockings and a garter.
Yeah, I think of it less in terms of like having to push things to the margins because of shame, and more just like they're just sort of existing in the space, but it's not the whole focus of the painting. And I've sort of experimented with different levels of explicitness in terms of like we've seen. Like,
so that would be a way of like kind of naturalizing it, right? Like
mm-hmm.
by not making it the centerpiece, as you said. Like it's not the pictorial focus of the work.
Yes.
And so due to its, I'm just kind of thinking this through here, but due to its like marginality, it becomes weirdly like, it's almost a reverse of how I was interpreting it. It becomes just like as commonplace as, this blue lamp on the left or the runner on the floor, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes like unsensationalized, mm-hmm. I guess. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or that's how I'm thinking about it.
I feel like we should open it up to some questions. Is that a good idea?
Sounds great.
Okay.
So, can you tell me if it's a conscious choice that you make? But there are figures, most of them, to me, seem almost, they could be androgynous, assuming that anybody can wear stockings and a garter.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a conscious choice you make?
I'm going to go, I've thought that too, and I'm glad you asked that. Let me go to, like, for example, this.
Yeah, I mean, to varying degrees. I think, sometimes the figures are directly sort of representative of myself, and I think I usually tend towards more female-bodied type figures. But I do like the sort of inherent ambiguity of like obscuring the genitals, for example, and like so you can't really tell what's going on. I like that sort of
Here as well, I was thinking that.
yeah, that kind of vagueness, and I think it's sort of, for me, speaks to kind of the sort of inherent mystery of our own, experiencing of our own sexualities and how that is kind of constantly unfolding and changing throughout our lives. What we want changes and grows, and yeah. So I like to keep it a little vague on purpose.
Okay, one more follow-up.
Go ahead.
So in many of your paintings, you have on the walls a smaller painting or a painting that has an element that is not folk or traditional. Like one that had a black and white or a grayscale.
I'm just going to try to find one of those when you're talking.
With the ear.
Oh yeah, that's way back at the beginning.
Okay,
Or,
sorry.
you know,
No, you're absolutely right. This is something there. The pictures within pictures is an interesting aspect of Anne's work.
So
There's one.
I'm sure each one of them has a reason, but is there generally speaking a reason like placing those little markers in?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the inclusion of black and white, photos or paintings in the painting it's a chromatic decision. Like it's an area where I don't want there to be color. So sometimes it's practical, but a lot of times it is also a way of paying homage to particularly women and queer artists. Like this is an Alice Neal painting, for example. This is an old Flemish painting of the Virgin Mary, and this is, I think, an Imogen Cunningham photograph. So artists that are working with, the body and sexuality.
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked that question because it was like one of the threads I wanted to sort of tug at in this conversation, because it also connects Anne to Ted Carey's work, because he does a lot of, whether it's the MoMA Sculpture Garden, the Marc Chagall murals in the Lincoln Center painting. And of course the Andy Warhol, those collector portraits. There's a lot of pictures within pictures, art within art, that I think it's a common ground, another weirdly shared territory between you and him. And Horace Pippin, as you can see there.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also like I sometimes will include landscapes or paintings of landscapes.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
That's the one that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to say about that ear, honestly. It just kind of happened, and I knew I wanted a black and white moment right there, and it's just kind of evolved that way. But a lot of times it's an intentional decision to include allusions to the natural world or to other artists that I want to,
Is that Matisse?
include.
Or is that?
Oh, here
Yeah.
in the book?
Yeah.
No, the book is actually based on a book that I have of this foot fetish photographer named Elmer Batters, who was working in the 1950s. Who
Where can I get?
definitely on the internet, yeah.
Jordan, did you have a question?
I've got two, and I'll start with one that relates to what's the conversation that's been going on. I just wondered if in the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, there is a kind of conservatism. I think maybe some Lutheran background to some Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch people. If that in any way it sort of informs or affects you and your decision to sort of be a little conservative in terms of sharing sexual desire in your paintings.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I grew up in a religious household, and my upbringing was fairly conservative in terms of how we talked or didn't talk about sex. And so I think a lot of the reason that I started painting this kind of imagery was sort of a way of trying to sort of reconcile those things in myself. And I think, I think it does sort of manifest in a way of varying degrees of explicitness.
So do you think over time we're going to sort of shed some of that, I would call it some suppression perhaps, and become a little more sort of direct
I mean, I don't know if we can ever change who we are completely. I don't know. I mean, I also think that there's a part of me that feels like I have, conflicting feelings about that that feature of my upbringing for sure. But I think there's also, like, I had a great childhood, and I feel really thankful to grow up where I did. And so there's sort of like a way of wanting to hold on to that as well.
I have a second question.
Go ahead.
In your paintings, you're relying on realistic perspective and sometimes a flattening.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also had, in 3 cases, I found a reverse perspective,
Mm-hmm.
where things got larger the further they get away from us. Is that unconscious, or is that deliberate?
I mean, I don't think I'm consciously thinking about a reverse perspective in particular, but I am interested in the sort of in it being intentional about not being too tied to realism of scale and like allowing a playfulness there.
And I mean, for this one on the screen, that is such an interesting element, the blue circle, which sometimes can read as an orb. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think it's a rug.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's meant to be a rug, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, what I noticed was that the tabletop of a chest and a table got bigger as we went back, just by a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was also a rug with that case, where the rug got at the what was be the further distance. Was
Well,
a little
if
wider.
we're talking about reverse perspective, I thought that was happening on this Christmas tree farm, because
Oh, yeah.
there are some like really, I mean, that kind of reverses the rules of perspective to have like the proportions should decrease as you move further back into space, of course, if this were complying with those rules, right?
Right.
But you're kind of bringing up an issue that maybe I wasn't super clear about before, but I do feel like both Anne and Ted Carey, due to their interest in that sort of American vernacular painting and the sort of pictorial traditions that come along with it, they do skew perspective in their work. That's kind of one of the dominant features of that genre in a way.
Well, I think these 3 different ways of dealing with perspective all together in the same work and playing against each other, just fascinating and wonderful, I think. So I like it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Jess?
I'm just curious, you've done all this work, and spent all this time, really, as Anne said, detective work about Ted's work, and I'm wondering what your plans are, since you have sort of opened up this Pandora's box.
Well, the good thing is I don't think of it as a Pandora's box, right? Because it's actually, but I'm excited because I do. This is a permanent collection exhibition that is, drawing upon the Guildhall collection, those 9 particular Ted Carey paintings that live here, and in the process of putting together the show and doing the research, I mean, I really did recently just discover the location. I mean, you saw the checklist in the beginning. I knew that there were roughly 15 paintings in existence, but I didn't know where the other 6, I didn't know where all the other 6 lived. And now I do. Actually, I know where, with the exception of one elusive painting that I think will hopefully will surface at one point, and that's a portrait of Ray Johnson. But the others now I know are in central Pennsylvania, in the Lancaster area. And so I am actually planning a research trip there in the near future. I've been in touch with the custodians of those paintings, and I'm going to have a chance to examine them in person and hopefully continue with this research. I feel now excited and kind of responsible for beyond this exhibition and beyond these wonderful lectures that, I'm not trying to compliment myself, but this opportunity to sort of talk about the work with people. Because, for example, 3 weeks ago, some of the you were there, and some of the feedback was really helpful to me. So I'm excited to continue with some more research and just compile more knowledge about this body of work. So I think it's ongoing.
So I think this is a great place to end. A couple of things. I can give Matthew lots of compliments. He did a great job at his last lecture. I we all appreciate it. And thank you so much for traveling to see us. And we're so happy to hear about your work. And it was lovely that Matthew put the connections together and brought you to our attention. So I think everybody.
Yes,
really
Anne,
enjoyed
it was
it.
like so. I really enjoyed. Anne and I were in contact for several weeks through email, and we had a Zoom conversation, but we only, met in person yesterday. But I found your commentary incredibly thoughtful and illuminating, and I just really enjoyed hearing about your perspective on your own work and folk art and Pennsylvania German culture in general. It was really fascinating.
Oh, such a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. Anthony so thoughtfully put out our season program guide and some brochures for the exhibitions. These current exhibitions are on view through July 14th. Please look at guildhall.org for all of the things that are coming up. Our theater reopens in July. You can see everything that's happening. The next exhibition that we'll have will be Julian's novel. It'll open with the gala, so that's in early August. August 2nd is the gala, and it'll open to the public on August 4th. But lots to do here at Guildhall. Thank you all so much for coming.